The twin moons of Vega 4 hung low in the night sky, casting a cold silver glow over the settlement. A thin mist rolled in from the valley, curling through the narrow dirt roads that wound between simple, functional homes. It was a quiet place, far from the core worlds, and Jonas Creed had worked hard to keep it that way. He sat on the front steps of his farmhouse, a worn rifle resting across his lap, though it hadn't fired a shot in years. Beside him lay Max, his old battle dog, his fur streaked with gray but his body still powerful, still watchful. Max had been with him for nearly a decade, long enough to understand that a soldier's work was never truly done, even in peace. Jonas ran a hand over the scars on the dog's flank, reminders of wars neither of them spoke about anymore. Vega 4 was supposed to be their quiet exile, a place to forget the blood and the screaming, but the Empire had a way of reaching into places it had no business being. The patrols had been increasing lately, their black armored troopers moving through the settlement like they owned it. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. Jonas heard it a second later, the hum of repulsor lift engines. The dog rose to his feet, muscles tensing. Jonas sighed and pushed himself up as the Imperial patrol came into view. A wedge-shaped transport settled onto the road, kicking up dust as it landed. The ramp hissed open, and 6 soldiers marched out, led by a man in the gray uniform of an officer. He was young, sharp-featured, with a practiced arrogance that only Imperials could wear so effortlessly. "Evening, sir," Jonas said, his voice steady. He stayed on his porch, one hand resting lightly on Max's back. The officer approached with measured steps, his hands clasped behind him. "Jonas Creed?" Jonas gave a slow nod. "That's me." The officer glanced around, as if unimpressed by the small farmhouse. "Captain Darius Voss, 12th Imperial Infantry. We're conducting a census of non-registered assets. Livestock, weapons, anything that could be considered unnecessary." Jonas narrowed his eyes. "You see a lot of unnecessary out here, Captain?" Voss's gaze dropped to Max. "Big animal," he noted. "What breed?" Jonas didn't answer. One of the soldiers, a younger trooper with a nervous stance, took a step forward. "Sir, I think it's one of those war dogs from the outer campaigns." "Augmented, maybe." Voss nodded, looking mildly interested. "That true?" Jonas exhaled slowly. "He's mine. Has been for a long time." Voss tilted his head, as if weighing the situation. "The Empire has regulations about unregistered war assets." "He's not a weapon," Jonas said evenly. "He's a companion." Max stood rigid at his side, his golden eyes locked onto the soldiers. The tension thickened as the moment stretched. Then Voss smiled, a thin, humorless thing. "Well, companion or not, regulations say animals with combat augmentations belong to the Empire. We'll be taking him." Jonas didn't move. "You won't." Voss's smile faded. He looked at the nearest trooper. "Sergeant." The soldier hesitated, then raised his rifle. Max let out a low, rumbling growl. Jonas clenched his jaw. "I fought your wars," he said, his voice quiet but unshaken. "I bled for them. This is all I have left, and you're not taking him." Voss considered him for a long moment, then sighed. "You old soldiers and your sentimentality." He turned to his men. "Shoot the damn thing." Jonas moved, but not fast enough. The rifle cracked. Max yelped once, a sharp, pained sound, then crumpled to the ground. Blood pooled beneath his body, dark against the dirt. Jonas froze. Something inside him splintered, then burned. He stared at his oldest friend, his hands curling into fists. The soldiers were already turning away, their work done, but Jonas wasn't finished. His fingers found the knife on his belt. A lifetime of muscle memory took over. He lunged, slashing in a clean, vicious arc, and the nearest trooper barely had time to cry out before he collapsed, blood spilling from his throat. The others shouted, scrambling for their weapons. Jonas ducked, grabbed the fallen soldier's blaster, and fired. Another trooper dropped. Voss staggered back, hand reaching for his sidearm, eyes wide with disbelief. "Kill him," he barked. A rifle cracked, and pain exploded through Jonas's side. He stumbled but kept moving. He managed one more shot before another blast tore through his chest. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring. Max lay a few feet away, still and silent. Jonas tried to reach for him, but the strength left his body. His fingers brushed cold fur, then nothing at all. Voss exhaled sharply, lowering his blaster. Idiot. He looked at his remaining men. Burn the bodies. We're done here. As the flames rose behind them, the Imperials boarded their transport and vanished into the night, leaving only ash and silence. They never even considered what they had started. The message arrived in the dead of night. A simple transmission, cold and clinical. Unregistered civilian neutralized during Imperial patrol. Cause, lethal force. No further action required. Gabriel Creed read it twice, his expression unchanging, his breath slow and measured. The words carried no weight, no hint of the truth behind them. To the Empire, it was a minor incident, another nameless casualty in a galaxy that belonged to them. But Gabriel knew better. He knew the man who had been left burning in the dirt. He knew the dog that had died at his feet. And the soldiers who had pulled the trigger had no idea what they had done. A deep, awful silence settled over him as he sat in his private quarters aboard the Vindicator, the flagship of the Terran Black Legion. The warship hummed softly around him, its vast hull drifting in the void, hidden from Imperial sensors. Outside the thick glass of his viewport, the distant sun of Vega 4 burned like a dying ember. Gabriel exhaled slowly and set the datapad aside. His fingers curled against the polished steel of his desk, muscles coiling with quiet restraint. For 10 years, he had built his forces in the shadows, waiting, preparing. The Empire had taken everything from him once before, his home, his people, his honor. He had learned patience, had learned how to fight them on their terms. But this? This was something else. They hadn't just taken a soldier. They had taken his father. And they had shot Max. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, forcing the fire in his chest to settle into something colder, sharper. Then he stood. He crossed the dimly lit room, pressing his palm to a control panel by the door. The biometric scanner chirped in recognition, and the heavy metal doors hissed open. The corridor beyond was quiet, the air tinged with the scent of oil and steel. The Black Legion did not waste time on luxury. 2 men stood outside, waiting. Both straightened the moment they saw him. Matthias Rourke, his second in command, was a wall of muscle wrapped in matte black armor, a scar tracing the side of his jaw. He had served with Gabriel in the Empire's own legions before they defected, before they saw the truth of the machine they had once oiled with their own blood. Beside him stood Varen Holt, leaner, sharper, his fingers twitching at his side as if itching for the weight of a blade. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried the weight of a knife sliding between ribs. Gabriel's voice was calm, but there was something in it that made both men stiffen. We're mobilizing. Matthias frowned. Orders changed? No, Gabriel said. The timeline has. Varen's gaze flicked to the datapad Gabriel still held, reading the reflection of text in the polished metal of the corridor. When he looked back up, there was no need to ask. He already knew. Matthias exhaled sharply. When? Gabriel turned, heading toward the war room. Now. The Black Legion had spent years waiting for the right moment. They had gathered ships, weapons, soldiers. Men who had seen the truth of the Empire and chosen to fight rather than kneel. But even the best laid plans meant nothing in the face of this. The Imperials thought they had crushed a nameless farmer in an unremarkable colony. They didn't know they had just signed their own death warrants. The war room was a cavernous space, lit by the glow of holographic displays. Officers snapped to attention as Gabriel entered, their eyes sharp, their faces hard. These were not men bound by duty alone. They had all lost something to the Empire. Gabriel stepped to the center of the room, where a three-dimensional map of Vega 4 hovered in the air, rotating in eerie silence. A dozen red markers dotted the landscape: Imperial patrol stations, supply routes, minor garrisons. He reached out, tapping the settlement where his father had died. We begin here. A murmur passed through the room, but no one questioned him. Matthias folded his arms. Tactical overview? Gabriel's jaw tightened. They have a small outpost near the colony. Lightly manned, minimal orbital support. No reinforcements expected for at least 3 days. He let his gaze sweep over the gathered men. We take it first. Then we cut off their communications. By the time the rest of the Empire realizes what's happening, Vega 4 will be ours. Varen smiled faintly. No survivors? Gabriel met his eyes, his voice like steel. None. The Black Legion had not survived this long by showing mercy. The Empire did not offer it, so they would receive none in return. This was not just retribution. It was a message. One of the officers hesitated. General, this will draw attention. We won't be able to hide after this. Gabriel nodded. I'm counting on it. For years, the Empire had dismissed them as a minor threat, a scattered resistance that could be crushed when the time came. That illusion was about to be shattered. Matthias grinned, cracking his knuckles. It's about time. Gabriel turned back to the map, his mind already moving through the steps. The Imperials would be slow to react. They always were. They would assume this was an isolated attack, a localized uprising. They wouldn't realize until it was too late. He exhaled, slow and controlled, then tapped the console, highlighting the next phase of the operation. Prepare the strike teams. We move at dawn. No one questioned him. They knew what was coming. And by the time the Empire understood what they had done, there would be nothing left of their forces on Vega 4 but ashes. The Imperial outpost on Vega 4 was quiet in the early morning hours. A skeleton crew manned the perimeter, their vigilance dulled by routine. The settlement had never posed a threat before. It was just another nameless colony under the Empire's heel, its people too beaten down to resist. The soldiers stationed here were not elite, just another detachment assigned to enforce compliance, to remind the locals who ruled the stars. They never saw the Black Legion coming. Gabriel Creed stood in the tree-line, shrouded in the shadows of the pre-dawn light. The Vindicator had remained in low orbit, jamming communications, cutting off any chance of reinforcement. Below, his men had moved into position like wraiths, silent and precise. Through his scope, Gabriel watched the nearest sentry, a bored-looking trooper leaning lazily against a supply crate. The man turned his head, yawning, just in time for Gabriel to squeeze the trigger. The silenced round struck cleanly between his eyes. He was dead before he hit the ground. Across the perimeter, the rest of the sentries fell in near-perfect unison, their bodies crumpling into the dirt without a sound. The Legion moved forward. Matthias led the first strike team, slipping through the outpost's eastern gate. The guards at the entrance barely had time to register their presence before knives slit throats, boots crushed windpipes, and suppressed blaster bolts ended what little resistance they could muster. Inside, the barracks stirred. Someone must have noticed something, a missing patrol, an odd silence. A soldier stumbled out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He opened his mouth to call out, but a blade buried itself in his throat before he could make a sound. The alarm never came. Gabriel moved through the outpost like a ghost, his rifle held steady, his movements precise. Every room, every corridor, every hallway they entered became a graveyard within seconds. The Imperials didn't stand a chance. They were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and completely unaware of what they had invited upon themselves. One officer managed to fire a shot before Matthias crushed his skull against a wall. Another scrambled for the calm station, fingers desperately trying to send a distress signal. Varen was faster. His knife sank deep into the man's back, twisting before he yanked it free. Gabriel found Captain Voss in the command building. The same man who had ordered his father's death, the same arrogant officer who had dismissed a loyal companion as nothing more than an unregistered asset. He was awake now, his uniform half-buttoned, his face contorted in shock as he fumbled for his weapon. Gabriel didn't give him the chance. He lunged, slamming Voss against the console, pinning him with his forearm. The captain struggled, eyes wide. Who? Gabriel drove a fist into his ribs, cutting off the question. You don't even remember, do you? His voice was ice, controlled rage simmering beneath the surface. Voss coughed, gasping. "W.H. what?" Gabriel leaned in close. "Jonas Creed. Vega 4. A war dog that was worth more than your entire command." Recognition flickered in Voss's eyes, followed by something that might have been fear. Gabriel didn't let him speak. He grabbed the officer's blaster from his holster and pressed it against his chest. "For my father," Gabriel said, and pulled the trigger. Voss spasmed, choking on his own blood as he crumpled to the floor. Outside, the massacre was nearly complete. Black Legion soldiers moved through the outpost, ensuring no one remained. The air stank of smoke and blood. A few Imperials had tried to flee. None had made it past the perimeter. Matthias approached, wiping blood from his knuckles. "No survivors." Gabriel nodded, stepping over Voss's corpse as he exited the command building. The sun was rising now, casting long shadows over the dead. The Empire had thought itself invincible, untouchable. They were about to learn otherwise. Gabriel turned to his men. "Burn it." Without hesitation, the Legion set the outpost ablaze. Flames consumed the barracks, the armory, the command center. The smoke would be seen for miles, a message to anyone watching. The Empire had made a mistake. And the Black Legion was coming for them. The news of the massacre reached Imperial High Command within hours. Communications had been severed, but satellite surveillance had captured the smoldering wreckage of the outpost on Vega 4. Bodies lay where they had fallen, charred remains of barracks still crackling under the morning sun. No distress signals had been received. No survivors had been found. It was not an attack. It was an extermination. Admiral Sorenvale stood rigid before the holodeble aboard the ISV Tyrant, his sharp features locked in a grimace as the footage looped before him. The outpost had been nothing more than a routine security station, meant to enforce Imperial law on the colony. It should have been an afterthought. Instead, it had become a message. The Black Legion had resurfaced. "They made a mistake," Vale said, his voice cold. "They should have stayed hidden." Around the table, his officers shifted uncomfortably. They had all seen the reports. Gabriel Creed's insurgency had been whispered about in the dark corners of the Empire, a shadow war that had never quite gained traction. Until now. A young intelligence officer cleared his throat. "Sir, local surveillance confirms complete loss of Imperial assets in the region. The colony has fallen under enemy control. No additional forces in the system." Vale narrowed his eyes. "How many men did they field?" The officer hesitated. "Unknown." The outpost was taken within minutes. Silence settled over the room. They all knew what that meant. The Black Legion hadn't just hit the outpost. They had dismantled it with terrifying efficiency. Vale turned to another officer. "What assets do we have within striking distance?" A grizzled commander stepped forward. "The ISV Hammerfall is 2 systems away. They can be here within 18 hours. "Too long," Vale muttered. He tapped the table, bringing up a wider strategic map. "Deploy the Tyrant immediately. No more delays." His gaze hardened. "We are not letting Creed slip away this time." The officers saluted and dispersed, the war machine of the Empire lurching into motion. Far below, on the surface of Vega 4, Gabriel Creed stood on the balcony of what had once been the Imperial command post, now stripped of its banners and insignias. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of the outpost, the scent of burned steel and bodies lingering in the air. The people of Vega 4 had been hesitant at first, uncertain of what came next. They had seen what happened to those who resisted the Empire before. But Gabriel had made his intentions clear. This wasn't just revenge. This was liberation. Matthias joined him, arms crossed. "We should expect a response soon." Gabriel didn't look away from the horizon. "Let them come." Varen approached from the stairwell, a small smirk on his face. "Intercepted a message. The Tyrant is en route." Gabriel finally turned, his expression unreadable. How long? Less than 10 hours. Matthias exhaled sharply. That's sooner than expected. Gabriel nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. The Tyrant was a heavy-class warship, meant for planetary suppression. If they engaged it in orbit, they would be outgunned. But if the Empire was desperate enough to deploy it this quickly, that meant they weren't prepared for a drawn-out fight. Deploy the jammers, Gabriel ordered. Scramble their targeting systems. Set up fallback positions outside the colony. His eyes darkened. We'll make them bleed for every inch. Varen grinned. Now we're talking. As the Black Legion prepared for battle, the Empire's desperation grew. They had thought themselves invincible. Now, they were beginning to realize the truth. Gabriel Creed wasn't just fighting for vengeance. He was declaring war. The ISV Tyrant cut through the void like a dagger, its hull bristling with weaponry, its engines burning white-hot as it descended toward Vega 4. Admiral Vale stood on the bridge, arms clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the display. Below, the colony sprawled beneath an amber sky, its surface marred by the scars of conflict. The outpost was gone, reduced to rubble and ash, and now the insurgents held the planet. It was unacceptable. Creed had gone too far. Begin orbital bombardment, Vale ordered. The gunnery officer hesitated. Sir, our targeting systems are scrambled. We can't get a precise lock. Vale's expression darkened. Then fire indiscriminately. The ship's massive cannons roared to life, launching fire and death toward the surface. Explosions tore through the outskirts of the colony, sending plumes of dust and flame into the air. But even as the bombardment rained down, the enemy did not run. They did not scatter like frightened civilians. Instead, they moved, calculated, disciplined, unshaken. Gabriel Creed watched from the command tower, his expression impassive. The Empire still believed brute force was the answer. They were wrong. Are the disruptors in place? He asked. Matthias nodded. Buried deep. They won't see it coming. Good. Gabriel activated his calm all units, hold positions. Wait for my signal. The bombardment continued, but the Black Legion endured. They had fought on harsher worlds, against worse odds. This was nothing new. Then, as the Tyrant drifted lower, Gabriel gave the order. A low-frequency pulse surged from the colony's core, an electromagnetic detonation that rippled through the sky. The Tyrant's lights flickered. Consoles sparked. Warning klaxons blared as the ship's systems sputtered and died. Vale's eyes widened. What? EMP strike, sir, a technician shouted. We're losing control. Gabriel watched as the massive warship lurched, its engines choking. It was still airborne, but vulnerable. And that was all he needed. Now, he commanded. From the cliffs surrounding the colony, hidden anti-aircraft batteries roared to life. Streaks of red-hot plasma tore through the sky, striking the Tyrant's hull. Armor buckled. Explosions rippled along its length. On board, Vale grabbed the railing as the ship shuddered violently. Return fire. Sir, weapons are offline. Vale's gut twisted. He had underestimated Creed. Again. Then came the final strike. The Vindicator, Creed's personal warship, emerged from the storm clouds above, cannons primed. With a single precise shot, it struck the Tyrant's exposed engine block. Fire erupted. The warship groaned, metal tearing as gravity took hold. Vale braced for impact. The Tyrant plummeted. Gabriel watched as it crashed into the wastelands beyond the colony, a burning wreck upon the sands. The ground quaked. A firestorm rose. Silence followed. Then, a slow cheer built among the Legion. The people of Vega 4 watched in stunned disbelief. The Empire had fallen. Matthias exhaled. It's over. Gabriel turned from the wreckage. Not yet. The Empire would come. They always did. But today, Vega 4 was free. And Gabriel Creed was just getting started.